welcome to Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and joining me on the show today is Congressman Tom McClintock, who represents California's 4th District. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks for having me back.
It really is a pleasure to have you on the show. I know how big your district is and how many people want to hear from you, so thank you for making the time for Calaveras County. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for making the time.
Tell our viewers, what is your district? What area does it cover?
Well, it's pretty much the Sierra Nevada. It starts up in Truckee in Nevada County and then moves south along the Sierra all the way to Kings Canyon in Fresno County. So it includes Lake Tahoe, Yosemite Valley, the Kings Canyon National Forest, National Park, along with the major cities of Roseville, Rockland, El Dorado Hills.
I'd say you could argue that's one of the prettiest places in the world.
Oh, I don't think there's any argument about it. I think it is.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, we're fortunate to have you. How long have you been representing this area?
The district was reapportioned 4 years ago, so for 4 years I've had the honor to represent this region here.
And how do you make the time to be back on the East Coast in Washington and yet also be here to talk to your constituents?
I come back to the district every week. I figured out a long time ago that if you come back to the district every week and hold at least one public meeting, you're not going to get into a lot of trouble in Congress because the district won't let you. You start screwing up, they'll let you know straight off. So I come back mainly to learn things. You know, I don't know anything unless somebody tells me.
And before we get into the issues, what is it that keeps you in public service? What is it that drives you to continue serving?
A growing recognition that this country has drifted far from its founding principles, and those founding principles are the best prescription for human happiness that has ever been created in the history of mankind. We have been lucky enough to inherit those principles, and I'm afraid that we're losing them.
Your election status, you are currently running for election again. You just had a large victory in the primary. What's coming this fall for you?
Well, we'll have the general election in November, and then if the people will have me, I'd love to represent this district for another 2 years in Congress.
We just had a unimaginable tragedy in Florida very recently.
It wasn't a tragedy, it was an atrocity. A tragedy is an accident. A tragedy is a bridge collapsing. This was an atrocity. This was a deliberate Islamic terrorist attack upon the United States. And until we recognize that, we're not going to be able to deal effectively with it.
So walk the viewers through what happened, and then let's get into the reasons about why this happened.
Well, this was an Islamic terrorist who was born in New York to a father who had come over from Afghanistan. We knew for years that the father had been broadcasting pro-Taliban and anti-American tirades to a growing Islamic Afghan population here in the United States. We knew that the terrorist himself had traveled several times to Saudi Arabia under very suspicious circumstances, that he had associated with known terrorists and known Islamic radicals in the United States. We knew that he had made virulent anti-American statements and repeated threats against this country, and yet we did nothing. And the reason we did nothing is because there are so many of these threats out there now that we can't begin to adequately assess or address them.
I had read that we had looked at him, the FBI had looked at him, and like you said, did nothing. Is that because they didn't have enough evidence to actually make a charge stick?
It's because they didn't have the time, because they got so many other cases they have to go chasing after. I mean, this is the sad state of affairs our country is in. For more than 8 years now, we have had virtually wide open borders. Anybody can come across without being challenged by authority. At the same time, we've had a deliberate policy under this administration of mass immigration of refugees from hotbeds of Islamic extremism without proper vetting. And we do need to realize there are some people who are fleeing Sharia law and this Islamic political extremism, and within assimilable levels, they should be welcome into this country. But the problem is, many of them are coming here to impose Sharia law, to impose that extremist Islamic political philosophy. They have no business being in this country, and yet this administration makes absolutely no distinction between the two.
So where was the failure here that led to Orlando?
I think that the failure was multiple, but I think that the ultimate problem was We have allowed a population into the United States that is actively hostile to American constitutional principles and is virulently hostile to our country and what it stands for. And I think at the same time, we have made it increasingly difficult for Americans to defend themselves against these kinds of attacks. We're told, oh, well, just wait till the police come. Well, if you remember, in San Bernardino, the terrorists had already fled the scene, had already done their destruction before the police even arrived on the scene. In the case of Orlando, once the police got there, it was more than 3 hours before they confronted the terrorists with lethal force. Meanwhile, more people were killed. Others bled to death because nobody was there to shoot back because it's a gun-free zone. That's one of the big problems. In a gun-free zone, the gunman is king. The first line of defense against an armed terrorist is an armed American. And this administration has been making it more and more difficult for Americans to defend themselves. So on the one hand, you have policies that are dramatically increasing the threat to our country, and at the same time, policies that are making it more and more difficult for Americans to defend themselves.
So that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And here we are.
And here we are. So we saw the California attack, the Florida attack. Do you see a trend beginning to be built here?
Oh, of course. We have a massive fifth column that has now been embedded in this country, has been embedded deeply in our communities, and we're going to see increasingly frequent and severe attacks until we confront it.
There are many issues here, but the two main ones that I'd like to focus on are, one, the policy of who we allow in the country and who we don't. So let's just hit on that. You just told me what the current administration is allowing. How would we do that differently to have better results? Well,
the House last year passed the SAFE Act, which required that before a refugee could be admitted from hotbeds of Islamic extremism in Iraq and Syria, there had to be affirmative evidence that they were loyal to this country, that they had worked with American forces overseas, or that they were legitimately fleeing Sharia law and Islamic oppression in those countries. Right now, all that we do is we ask them for their name. They give us their name, whatever it is. We run it through multiple databases, and if it doesn't come up with anything derogatory, they're allowed in. That's what the president calls proper vetting. The San Bernardino, one of the San Bernardino terrorists went through that proper vetting. The SAFE Act would say, no, you have to have affirmative evidence that this person does not come here with hostile intent. That passed the House and on a bipartisan vote, and yet it has been blocked by Senate Democrats at the behest of President Obama.
What is the problem with that extra vetting in light of these shootings?
As I said, this administration makes no distinction between those who are legitimately fleeing the oppression of Sharia law and those who are coming here with the intent of imposing it on this country.
Just seems like kind of an odd position to take for the administration, but
and ultimately suicidal if we allow it to continue. And these attacks will grow in frequency and severity until we stop and reverse these policies, and that is going to require a very different leader in the White House from the one we have right now.
So what would it take, or did you just say what it would take? We need a new president.
It's going to take an election. It's going to take a new president who is determined to confront Islamic terrorism. The first thing he's got to be able to do is use the term Islamic terrorism, something that Hillary Clinton has been very, very reluctant to do, and the president has absolutely refused to do. That's what it comes down to. I think this becomes a referendum on the massive illegal immigration and the deliberate importation of Islamic extremists into the United States.
Second big issue that Orlando brings up is gun control. And I've heard a lot of speeches, one way and the other, based on this, to try to change policy because of these. How do you feel about the gun control proposals?
Well, I think they're ludicrous. They are based on the assumption that a terrorist who is absolutely intent on savagely killing Americans, who has contempt for everything about this country, including its laws, is going to make one single exception to that contempt, and that is that they will meticulously obey our gun control laws. That is insane. of the only people who obey our gun control laws are law-abiding American citizens, which ends up disarming Americans while assuring that Islamic extremists and terrorists have full access to weaponry, because after all, there is an international arms market, and these terrorists can obtain weapons of their choice just as easily as a teenager can buy pot down the street.
Is it fair to say that if you did severely limit the access and make it harder, that could potentially limit these attacks? I mean, is that a fair argument?
No, I don't think it's a fair argument at all. In fact, quite the contrary. One of the most deadly terror attacks was in Paris last year. Paris, in a nation that has some of the most strictest gun controls in the world. The fact is, terrorists obtain firearms, obtain weapons from an international market. And again, as long as our southern border is wide open, there is plenty of opportunity to smuggle those weapons into the United States. They don't obey our laws. Only American citizens who are law-abiding obey those laws, and they're the ones who are then placed in an extreme disadvantage. As I said, in a society without guns, the gunman is king.
So just to look at the other side, why are so many people so staunchly opposed to what you support, and what is it that they're standing on to say, okay, we need to limit? What would be their reasoning?
You can't reason somebody out of a position that they haven't been reasoned into. This is an emotional response. Guns kill people, therefore we have to get rid of guns. And the problem with that is the people who are going to kill folks are going to obtain those guns. The question is whether law-abiding people have the ability to defend themselves. The best defense against a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. The best defense against an armed terrorist is an armed American. These laws make it more and more difficult for good guys with guns, for armed terrorists to confront the bad guys with guns and the armed terrorists.
Now, do you think that gun control policy belongs at a federal level, or should it really be up to the states to decide how they handle things?
We have a Second Amendment. That is a federal law. In fact, a constitutional provision in our Bill of Rights that protects for every American their right to defend themselves by the use of firearms, to defend themselves and to defend their freedom.
However, it seems like at a state level, certain states allow certain weapons while they don't allow others, certain cities, so on and so forth. So,
well, and that's become a huge problem because those states that do allow their citizens to shoot back, that do allow their citizens to defend themselves, those folks often travel to other states where their possession of firearms lands them in jail. There is something called the full faith and credit of state laws. States are supposed to recognize the laws enacted by other states. That's why your marriage certificate in one state is also good in another. That's why your driver's license from one state is good in another. The same policy ought to apply to your Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. And there is legislation that has been pending in the House for many years to do so. Unfortunately, we've not been able to move it out of the House.
There's one more component to this that I'd like your take on. We have folks who really are Islamic terrorists. There's no doubt about that. But we also have people who are mentally ill who are committing these attacks.
I mean, that's the other thing. You've got dedicated criminals and you've got the mentally ill. And we know how to protect ourselves from these people. We did it for many, many years. In the case of gun predators, we put them in jail for the rest of their lives. We don't let them out on the streets. In the case of the mentally ill, when we identify people who are dangerous to themselves or to others, we can find them and we get them the help they need. Those are the laws that the American left has been so successful in tearing down over the past 20 years. And it shouldn't surprise us that as those laws have been diminished, we have seen an increase in violent crime. Interestingly enough, the most violent cities in the nation, such as Chicago, are those with the most stringent gun controls. And as I said, it all goes back to that simple principle that if law-abiding people can't defend themselves, armed criminals, armed madmen, and armed terrorists rule the land.
Could you expand on the rules that had worked with the mentally ill in the past, and you said have been torn down?
Yes, there was a due process provision. Once you were identified as being as being suspected of being a threat to yourself or to others. In other words, you come into contact with law enforcement. Law enforcement observes you, realizes that there's not something quite right in the head. They were allowed to detain you for 72 hours, and in that time you were brought before a judge. And the judge then assessed the evidence, and if he agreed that the preponderance of evidence suggested that you were a threat to yourself, you could be involuntarily confined while we got you the help you needed. You were then not only assured of getting that help, you were also assured of not being a threat to others in the meantime. But again, those laws have been torn down over the years, and we're now dealing with the result.
If someone is confirmed to be mentally ill and potentially a threat to themselves or others, would you support not allowing them to purchase firearms?
Well, of course, but with the full due process rights that our Constitution assures.
Got it. You mentioned that in order to address these issues, we really need new leadership from the top down, not just maybe at a lower level. We really need a leader of the country who's going to have a different stance. So let's talk about the election. We have Donald Trump, we have Hillary Clinton going at each other. Can you give us a little overview of how we have gotten to the point? Because it's been a very interesting primary season.
It has been. Well, I think things have been so bad in this country for so long. People are no longer interested in a president who's going to hold their hands and share their tears and feel their pain. They're looking for the meanest SOB in the country to go to Washington, kick butts, take names, and set things right. And I think that that's one of the appeals of Donald Trump. I wish he was more. I wish he had more of Ronald Reagan's sunny disposition. But there is no doubt in my mind that he will change the policies that have so badly damaged our economy and threatened our security of our nation.
Well, what are some of those policies that have damaged the economy?
Ultimately, I think, with respect to the economy, it's not all that difficult. We know how to revive an economy. We've done so many times before. When you reduce the tax and regulatory burdens, the economy thrives. That's what Ronald Reagan did in the early 1980s. That's what John F. Kennedy did in the early 1960s. On the other hand, if you impose additional taxes and regulations and litigation on an economy, that economy withers. We saw that under George W. Bush, and we saw that under Jimmy Carter, and we saw that under Herbert Hoover, and we saw that under Barack Obama. So the first thing you've got to do is reverse the policy, this huge amount of regulatory burden that's been heaped on the country. The tax increases that we've seen have done enormous damage to the economy. Those need to be reversed. They will be continued under Hillary Clinton. They will be reversed under Donald Trump. But ultimately, I think what Trump has done is succeed in turning this election into a referendum on illegal immigration. I don't think there's a single person in this country, from the most radically left to the most radically right, who would doubt the veracity of this statement that if Donald Trump is elected president, illegal immigration will stop. And I think that's essentially what the election is going to come to this fall, and I think that's why he's going to be elected president.
Now, Trump, he was in a very large field of, 17 or more opponents, and he ended up coming out on top. And
not just on top, it was with the vote divided 17 different ways. He has now received more votes in Republican primaries than any Republican candidate in history.
During those primaries and the primary and all of the debates and all of the media coverage, it really was unlike anything I've ever seen. And I haven't seen that many elections, but I feel like Trump made some statements that would have completely torpedoed other campaigns in the past. And so I feel like the election is completely different than in the past. And what's your take on that? How has Trump survived?
I think people are sick and tired of all of the politically correct nonsense that they've had imposed upon them from the time they enter high school to the time they draw their last breath. They are sick and tired of it. I think that they view Donald Trump as someone who speaks his mind even when it's not politically correct. And I think also that they've got their attention on the big picture, and that is of whether we're going to reverse the economic policies that have done so much to damage our country, as well as to reverse illegal immigration, which threatens our very security and identity as a nation.
Now, Trump has said some things that a lot of Republicans are somewhat uncomfortable with, to the point where Republicans are uncomfortable coming out and endorsing him. I think you even had endorsed, was it Ted Cruz prior?
Well, actually, I started with Scott Walker.
You started with Walker.
When Walker dropped out, I endorsed Ted Cruz. So Donald Trump's not my first choice for president. He's not even my second choice, but I sure as hell can tell the difference between a fire and a fireman. And we don't get another shot at this election. You know, this election will determine who's the president for the next 4 years. But if you look at the average length of service on the Supreme Court and the ages and the actuarial tables of the people who are currently on the court, yeah, the election will determine the president for the next 4 years. It will determine the Supreme Court for the next 16 years, probably for the next generation. So there's a great deal at stake with this election. And, you know, those Republicans are saying, oh, he's just not genteel enough for me. Oh, he said this awful thing, and I don't want anybody to call me names, and I just don't want to be. You know, that reminds me of something Ogden Nash once wrote. He said, they have such delicate palates, they can find no one worthy of their ballots. And then when someone terrible gets elected, they say, there, that's just what I expected. I think it would be a tragedy if Republicans who stayed home on Election Day woke up the next morning and realized the Supreme Court had gone radically to the left for the rest of their lifetimes.
And the fact...
Because they stayed home.
Because Trump does, you said, he is somewhat rough around the edges or more direct than other politicians are. Do you think that would hurt our image internationally to have that type of a person at the head of the country?
On the contrary, you know, the one thing that we lack these days around the world is respect. We don't need to be loved, but a nation like ours must be respected in an international situation such as that which we're confronting. I have absolutely no doubt they would respect him, they would fear him. Whether they like him or not is really irrelevant.
Do you believe that Trump will not do something that would be incredibly damaging to the country that maybe you wouldn't even agree with? Are you confident that he wouldn't go overboard in certain areas?
I think actually it may be a lot easier to contain him within the confines of the Constitution than it has been Barack Obama. And the reason for that is this. If Donald Trump were to attempt to abuse his executive authorities the way Barack Obama had, Democrats who right now rally to Obama's defense would oppose Trump strictly on partisan grounds, and there are enough constitutional Republicans who will oppose him on constitutional grounds. That does give us the 2/3 in the Congress that I think will very successfully restore the balance of executive and legislative authority. So, no, I don't see in many of Donald Trump's statements a respect for the constitutional limits of his office, but I do think that the dynamic will make it much, much easier to restrict him within those confines because of the math it will create in the Congress.
And that's where you get your security. While he may not have been your first choice, you still much prefer him versus Hillary.
Oh, night and day. Like I said, there's a difference between a fire and a fireman, and I sure as hell can tell the difference.
Can you tell me a little bit about Hillary and your experience with her and what kind of a leader she would make?
Well, she's a crook. I mean, we've seen that with the Clinton Global Fund and all of the fundraising they were doing from international enemies of the United States while she was Secretary of State. We have seen how completely reckless she was with the most sensitive secrets that our country has, like the names of our agents in foreign countries. And that still has yet to play out during the FBI investigation. I think she would be a complete disaster. But it again comes down to this. Is there anybody in the country who doubts, A, that illegal immigration will stop under Donald Trump, and is there anyone who disagrees with the fact that it will continue and it will increase under Hillary Clinton?
Can you give a slight recap of I could call it the email scandal for those who don't know? That's one of the main things that Hillary seems to be.
It's not just the email scandal. As Secretary of State, she had access to the most sensitive information that the United States government has. I mean, information that literally in the wrong hands could cost lives. In fact, it cost many lives. She is required by law to keep those on a secure government server. Instead, she transferred them to her personal server, which was easily hackable, and there is a growing amount of evidence that she did indeed transfer by this process the most sensitive secrets of the country to our most dedicated international enemies. That is a crime. It's being investigated by the FBI as a crime. And I believe that we have not heard the end of it, not by a long shot.
So are you saying she actually sent this information purposefully, or she allowed it to be hacked?
No, she recklessly placed that information on servers that were easily hackable, and I think that there's considerable reason to believe that a lot of that information by that process was lost to foreign enemies of this country.
And what repercussions does she face for these actions?
It's a crime. She could go to prison if she's. I mean, we have had many convictions under that law of people who have who had top security access to information and who recklessly handled that information.
So we have a presidential candidate who is facing potential prison time.
Yes.
Wow. Donald Trump seems to be going down in the polls right now. The gap, according to some polls, is widening between himself and Hillary. Part of this may be due to some statements he made about a judge that was looking into his Trump University. Is this going to go away? Is he going to come back, or is this?
I think he will. In fact, if you recall, just a week or so before that, he was running ahead of Hillary Clinton. And it's really interesting. I mean, if you look at the dynamic, there is a huge gender gap right now. But according to the polls, the gender gap is working in favor of Trump and against Clinton. There are more men voting for Trump than there are women voting for Clinton. And there is a huge party defection rate. But that also is working in Trump's benefit. Trump is getting far more Democrats voting for him than Hillary Clinton is getting Republicans voting for her. I think that his message on illegal immigration is resonating deeply in a lot of very traditionally un-Republican ethnic blue-collar communities. It's their jobs that are being taken by illegal immigrants. It's their families that are being threatened by the Mexican gangs. And I think that's the reason why Trump has done particularly well in those primaries that allow crossover voting, where Democrats and independents are allowed to cross over and vote in a Republican primary. That's where he's done his best. That suggests that what the polls are reporting is what's actually happening, and that is that there is a huge number of traditional Democratic voters that are listening to his message and saying, we've had enough, we've got to do something. I also think that because he was so viciously opposed by the Republican Party establishment, that gives him additional credibility with non-Republican audiences. I had a taste of that when I ran against Schwarzenegger back in 2003. The Republican Party establishment was totally against me. I had the rank and file with me, but the party establishment very much against me. People saw that every day. And according to the LA Times exit poll on Election Day, I actually got more votes from independents and Democrats than I got from Republicans because the party establishment was opposing me. They had permission to listen.
One last thing. Who wins in the fall?
I think Donald Trump led.
Donald Trump. Okay, Congressman, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and I hope you join me next time.